In the heart of southern Africa, a kingdom once rose with warriors whose footsteps echoed like thunder and whose discipline shaped legends. The Zulu kingdom, forged by Shaka Zulu's iron will and battlefield brilliance, became a symbol of resistance, resilience, and regality. But beyond the spears and shields, there were quiet nights under starlit skies, lullabies sung by fireside, and dreams that whispered through the valleys of KwaZulu. So close your eyes and rest your head, sleepy traveler. Tonight, we journey through the rise and fall of the Zulu kingdom, its traditions, triumphs, and the quiet strength behind every warrior's stance. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon for more sleepy tales from forgotten empires and legendary lands. You begin with the land because everything else depends on it. If you stand on a low ridge in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, and let your eyes follow the folds of grass into the gentle valleys, you will realize that history, as slow as water, is always looking for a channel. The hills are often soft-backed and steady, dressed with tufted grasses that harden during the winter and wake after the spring rains. Seasonal streams carve shallow courses through clay soils, and if you wait, you learn their timing. The haze of heat before the first storms, the smell of wet dust when the rain arrives, the glistening trickle that will feed the homestead fields, and the cattle in their stone-walled kraals. You are asked to notice the dull details, the things easy to miss. What months the grass browns, which gullies keep moisture longest, how much Nguni cattle wander when no one is watching, and how many steps it takes to carry a water pot from stream to hearth. Before there was a Zulu kingdom, there were these rhythms, repeated enough times to be mistaken for nature itself. The homestead, the umuzi, is a circle you can walk, and you will, daily. It is a bowl cupped in a shallow dip, with beehive huts arranged in a careful ring, and the cattle enclosure pressed like a pupil at the center. Each morning, doors of woven thatch peel open, and smoke presses upward through small gaps in roofs that are green when fresh and grey when old, and the wood frames creak in the wind. Children bring kindling. Men check the cattle for injuries, for ticks, for the signs of disease that creep silently in dry spells. Women test the grain in the clay bins, sorghum and millet stored in rounded, mud-plastered pits, the grain protected by care more than by walls. Your day starts in that quiet routine where nothing feels grand and everything is important. Grain must last until the next harvest. Beer must be brewed with deliberation. Milk must be strained through grass sieves, warmed in the sun and shared. These tasks are not the footnotes of life. They are the body of it, and they are what allow any leader to think he can build something larger than one circle of huts. Cattle anchor the homestead's economy with a gravity that pulls everything else into orbit. Bride wealth, status, ritual, insurance against crop failure, and the daily calories that come from milk and blood, and, on specific days, meat. You learn that cattle are counted not just as numbers but as biographies. This one descended from a clever cow that survived a difficult drought, that one marked by a coat pattern everyone still remembers. You do not need a ledger, you hold the herd in memory. Calves get names, oxen carry loads only after slow training. Bulls are watched as carefully as neighbors. Fences are often low, and watchfulness is the real barrier. In the evening, the cattle are brought into the central kraal, and their body heat and breath mingle with the dust, settling on the air with a smell familiar enough to be comfort. It is the smell of safety, of things counted and enclosed. You could call this tedious, but it is more accurate to call it foundational. Without this ritual, no war banners would ever unfurl, and no king would dare claim the right to organize other people's sons into regiments. You would see trade before you saw kingship if you watched long enough. To the east, distant traders on the coast moved beads and cloth in exchange for ivory and hides, and these goods filter inland slowly, often passing through many hands. The beads are not merely decorative, they carry messages when arranged in specific patterns and colors, stitched onto necklaces or strung into bracelets that say things the mouth does not. A message might be careful, a coded reply to a proposal of marriage, or a gentle refusal. These bead strings are the letters of a world where writing is done with color and sequence, and many read it fluently. Iron comes from small furnaces where charcoal and ore are coaxed into a bloom of metal, spongy and glowing. A smith will hammer this bloom repeatedly, quieting it into toughness. He will then draw it out into hoes, knives, spearheads, and deft, decorative tips. The percentage of carbon is not measured but felt through resistance and sound. Slow refinements make good tools make efficient fields make surplus, and surplus is the first thing a would-be ruler notices when he dreams in the middle of the night about organizing his neighbors. The social map looks like a tangle if you insist on borders and lines. It is not a map of hard edges, it is a map of relations. There are clusters of kin, households connected through marriage, obligation, and reputation. There are senior men, whose authority comes from age and experience rather than proclamation. If disputes arise, they consider them in shaded places with the almost lazily serious pace of people who will be living together tomorrow and next year. Decisions are negotiated, not dictated, and the pace of these negotiations is itself a political technology discouraging sudden ruptures. When rain is late, people remember who has spare grain and who has not. They remember who shared last time. They remember who kept feasts small during the lean months, who avoided drawing envy with a display of meat when neighbors were hungry. Leadership must be measured against these memory archives. The small moral accounts kept at the homestead level, irrigate, or dry out the possibilities of larger things. You will hear terms that sound grand: Mthethwa, Ndwandwe, Kwabe, Zulu, and you might expect to meet kingdoms already formed, standing confidently with banners and neat succession orders. Instead, you meet networks capable of hardening when pressed and softening to pass around obstacles. Leadership is tested in small ways that are not recorded in any annal. Who organized a raid that secured cattle without provoking revenge? Who negotiated a marriage that knit two awkwardly placed homesteads together? Who chose to move the cattle early when a disease was rumored across the ridge? In a mostly rain-fed agriculture, wisdom often takes the form of knowing when to leave in time, before the soil dries into a tired, unyielding crust. Small shifts in settlement are not a confession of weakness. They are a calculation carved into the habits of people who pay attention to the ground. You might expect violence to be a storm that arrives from nowhere, announcing itself with spectacle. But violence often begins as a series of tweaks to everyday logistics: walking the cattle further than usual to avoid a neighbor's envy, tightening the night watch on the outer ring of huts, stacking spears close, checking the lashings of shields so that rawhide binds do not fail on a hot day. There are innovations whispered in these adjustments. Men cut spears shorter to thrust more quickly. Shields are made broader or lighter, depending on the kind of skirmish expected. If you are listening carefully, you hear elders debate whether young men should carry 2 days dried meat or 3, whether to push through thorn thickets to surprise an enemy kraal, or wait for dawn and approach in a more orderly fashion. These are not stories of heroes. They are stories of preparations, which is where most human effort truly lives. Marriage arrangements are often described as transactions because cattle move from one homestead to another as bride wealth. But to understand them, you should stand quietly at the edge of a negotiation and notice the slow exchange, not only cows, but speeches. People detail the histories of cattle, the steadiness of a family, the temperament of a daughter, the fairness of a father. Beer is poured into wooden pots and passed around. Taste, nod, repair, continue. The marriage will connect fields and herds and reputations. Children will be raised between two homesteads that now have a reason to trust each other when the rains fail. These connections are a kind of engineering, more patient than building a wall, and often just as effective at keeping things together. A young man raised in this architecture of relations will later nod when a leader tells him that regiments are simply kinship made more regular. You can see why the argument would persuade, and you can see why some would resist, preferring the older pace of small circles to the hungrier pulse of an emerging state. There is a reputation attached to hunting, as though it is always noise and boasting. The hunters you observe are quieter than that. They carry spears balanced not for battle, but for the clean throw, and they move with attention to wind and ground, shoulders low, feet careful on the slope. Meat is not daily. It is a punctuation mark. The hide is useful, the fat is valuable, the bones can be split for marrow. Nothing is wasted. It is instructive to note that luxury in this world is a soft blanket of time without an urgent task, a long conversation with no decision at the end, a dry place to sit during steady rain. These are the luxuries granted to those whose homesteads are well managed and whose neighbors are not angry. Secure time is a product of good politics long before it is a product of good weapons. You could trace the eventual rise of the Zulu kingdom to a single figure because stories prefer simplicity, but it is just as honest to trace it to 1,000 kitchen fires. If you watch the making of porridge in the morning, a woman stirring a pot of sorghum meal until it thickens, tasting, adding a little more water to soften the texture, you learn what long practice looks like. Every homestead repeats the choreography with small variations. Even the stir of those pots sets a rhythm for the day. Work is not shouted into being, it grows from habit. Clothes are repaired with patient fingers. Roofs are rethatched with careful hands. Fences are maintained in sections, always a little too late, always just in time. A leader who tries to bend this ordinary rhythm to his will must find a way to write his orders into it. He must make his plan feel like the next step in an existing dance rather than a new tune played too loud. When you look at the broader region, you find a landscape of systems already intertwined, river valleys that carry soil and rumour, coastlines that leak foreign goods into inland markets, and grazing loops chosen to avoid the worst of the tsetse, fly, and the more dangerous neighbours. It is not wild, it is managed. Even the places that look empty are in use, part of someone's plan for next season, or a reserve in case of failed rains. Memory extends this management across decades. People remember where cattle fared well during a drought years ago. They remember which path flooded when the river was angry. If you plot these memories on a mental map, you realize that authority belongs not only to the present headman, but also to the dead. Ancestors are not only spirits, but also repositories of practical advice, invoked in ritual language, to guide decisions about planting and moving. The boundary between sacred and practical is thin. You do not need to know whether the ancestors speak to understand that their memory speaks through the living. The young grow up inside a system that is already sorting them. Work starts early, with small responsibilities scaled to size. Carrying water, minding the goats, learning how to check a fence, learning why certain words are not spoken at certain times. Boys watch older boys and then men. Girls watch their mothers and older sisters and learn the measures of a homestead's competence. Respect is not a sentimental word here. It is a method for distributing attention correctly. A boy who learns to sit and listen will later learn to stand and be obeyed. A girl who learns to keep a household's accounts of grain and milk in her head will later manage the nervous weeks before harvest with calm. This is training for a life in which surprises are often unwelcome, the slow anchor of routine being the defense against the world's unevenness. When a new regime arrives, and it will arrive to find people already trained to reliability by their days. You need to imagine the soundscape properly. There is the clank of iron when a hoe hits a stone, the hiss when a smith quenches a blade, the lowing of cattle, the small noises of sweeping with a grass broom, and the odd silence just before a storm when the air becomes heavy and clear. At night, musicians play with hollowed gourds and strings, with rattles made from seed and calabash, producing a steady, repetitive rhythm that is less performance than maintenance. Stories are told without hurry. Children fall asleep and wake to find the room still breathing with conversation. This is how knowledge is kept in long circular telling, where the same details are placed again in the same order, not because memory is poor, but because memory is precious, and reinforcement is its diet. The long telling makes the facts feel like part of the furniture. Leaders will later try to change this furniture. Some will manage, and some will find that the room refuses to be rearranged as easily as a plan drawn in the head. There is a discourse of fear that travels ahead of big changes. People speak of raiders, of a chief who is more ambitious than he should be, of a neighbor who is gathering weapons. But fear is never the only story. There is also the regularity of planting, the care with which beer is poured in ceremonies, the laughter that always seems to find a space in afternoons when the cattle are at pasture and the work is done for the moment. Joy is not staged. It appears wherever routine grants a small gift of time. You do not get a kingdom without this bedrock. A state is heavier without laughter to carry it in the hands of those who must do the carrying. The coastal wind, if you notice it, brings more than a smell of salt. It brings the thin edge of something changing. Traders with new fabrics, beads that take on different colors and meanings, rumors of new weapons. These changes reach inland unevenly, catching some homesteads early and brushing past others for years. When they finally install themselves, they do so through substitution rather than conquest. A new color bead becomes a message of consent between two young people. A new iron form becomes the preferred shape for a cutting blade. The revolution will not announce itself with music. It will be a change in what people find normal to hold in their hands. The state that will be named Zulu is already latent if you are looking with the right eyes. It is in the distance between homesteads, a distance chosen carefully to manage grazing and avoid quarrels. It is in the shared work parties that visit neighbors to help with big tasks, exchanging labor like a kind of currency. It is in the hands of men who can call people to gather, not with commands, but with the reputation that a gathering under their eye will be fair and efficient. These men must pay attention to detail, to the fairness of beer distribution, to the placement of latecomers, to the honor owed to elders, to the chatter of young men who try to test the limits of custom. The difference between a gathering and an army is, at first, only a matter of speed and a sharpening of attention. This is where you start to see how someone could train attention into drill, fold attention into obedience, and finally translate obedience into the architecture of a kingdom. If you are tempted to think of kings as inventors, think instead of them as editors. They do not create out of nothing, they trim and condense. They take what exists, the homestead's slow power, the cattle's centrality, the beadwork's language, the iron's quiet argument for precision, and they shorten the lines between them. Shorter lines mean faster transactions, quicker negotiation of marriage for political alliance, swifter movement of cattle for redistribution, tighter control of young men's energy through age cohorts formalized into regiments. Each shortening of a line creates an opportunity and a risk. Speed improves response to threats and to drought. Speed also makes mistakes large when they occur. The ambition to shorten lines is the ambition to create a kingdom. You can stand in an unremarkable valley and feel this ambition becoming possible. The kraal is full, the granaries are stable, the people are not anxious today. This is the context in which boldness can be attempted. You do not leap when the ground is loose, you leap when it is packed firm beneath your feet. That is what a clever leader waits for. The moment when people's days are steady enough that they can be asked to accept sharper routines and longer absences and tighter discipline. The cost is always borne by families who must adjust their daily cycles to the demands of the wider project. It is worthwhile only if the project returns something: security, prestige, a sense that one's sons will come home, seasoned rather than broken. The bargain must be negotiated without ever being stated too bluntly. In the evenings, the old tell the young about ancestors who moved homesteads during a famine without losing a single head of cattle, about a headman who settled a feud by giving away his best ox, about a woman who saved a season's harvest by catching a pest early. These stories are not tagged with moral lessons. The morals are the structure. They teach an ethic of calm adjustment, a dislike of panic, a respect for watchfulness. They also teach that sometimes the correct solution is sudden and decisive, because waiting would be dangerous. This is the paradox that the coming kingdom will exploit. People who dislike panic but recognize the right time to act can be formidable when organized. They will not waste motion. They will not love bravado. They will execute a plan with the same patience they use in stirring porridge. If you walked across this country with no guide, you might say that it looks ordinary, and that would be correct in the most important way. Ordinariness is the platform onto which all drama is loaded. You would see yards swept clean, huts repaired after windstorms, small boys herding calves with sticks they wield like batons, young women sitting in pairs beading with heads bent close. Ordinary is strong, ordinary survives, ordinary makes capacity. And when a man later argues that he can increase that capacity by assembling regiments, drilling movement, and coordinating supply, ordinary will decide whether to agree. You watch the deciding in small nods, in whether people arrive on time to a call, in whether they bring the right supplies without being told twice. The kingdom will rise when enough ordinary days decide to point in the same direction. At this point, you understand that any story that starts with a single name is already skipping steps. The ground is doing the work, the habit is doing the work, the conversations in low light are doing the work. The question becomes not whether a kingdom could appear, but how it would choose to wear the clothing of customs it cannot afford to discard. Which parts of the homestead sovereignty survive inside the larger circle? Which calendars of planting, of initiation, of ritual will be adjusted and which will resist change? How much of the kingdom can be built without tearing the fabric that keeps people fed and at peace? You stand then at the edge of the old world and the new, listening to both. The oxen chew methodically in the kraal. The rain for now is enough. The grain jars are sealed. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a headman is thinking in straight lines about the circles he wants to command, and he is wondering how to begin. Soon, people will say his name when they talk about power, but the quieter question is the one that will determine what comes next. In this landscape of careful routines and watchful moderation, what kind of promise could convince thousands of ordinary days to bend toward a single will? You return to the circle of the homestead because that is where lines begin before they stretch outward. You also return to an older map of names that at first do not sound like commands but like kinship titles, and the memory of agreements, whispered in shade, Methethwa along the coastal hinterland, Ndwandwe across the north, Kwabe to the south, and among these clusters a smaller name, Zulu, not yet the main current. You learn quickly that what later looks like centralization begins as a tension, one network paying steady, unshowy attention to the cracks between other networks. You can measure that attention in how often messengers are sent and how carefully they are received, how gifts rotate, how wealth is calibrated to avoid offense, how spring gatherings are staged so that young men can be seen without being flaunted. A confederation is not a fortress, it is a calendar made public, an agreement to show up and be counted. The Methethwa, under a leader whose reputation becomes that of a careful negotiator, begin to pull strands together by doing ordinary things. At larger scale, they call meetings with more regularity and insist on the small courtesies that make people believe the meeting was their idea. They improve the speed of messages by agreeing on relay points, where a runner, his chest thudding, with the last hill still inside him, hands a message to another with only a breath between. They discourage petty raiding among allied homesteads by organizing compensation before grudges harden. The trick is to settle differences quietly and to display solidarity publicly. If a caravan arrives from the coast with strings of beads, lengths of cloth, a few metal goods and rumour, the Methethwa see to it that distribution looks fair and looks slow, because both qualities calm nerves. Consider how people read fairness with their eyes before their minds have a chance to argue. A leader who knows this stays in power without raising his voice. Into this tightening weave comes a young man with an unsteady place at first. He is asked to prove himself not with proclamations but by fitting his will to a larger rhythm. He learns to drill men, to count hides, to read it the way a shield feels in a hand that has not yet thickened with callus, and to make that hand stronger by repetition rather than rage. He grows the argument for organization by demonstrating that ordinary tasks, watching cattle, preparing food, repairing fences, can be converted into a season of training without breaking the homestead's back. The math is modest and persuasive. If young men are gathered by age and exercise together, they will be ready to respond when called, and their families will plan around their absence. The families must agree because they bear the cost. So meetings lengthen, promises multiply. Chiefs learn to talk in a measured cadence that reassures, this will be like the last time, only more precise. You watch small inventions appear. Shield leather is selected more carefully. Hides from oxen of a certain age, tanned by hands chosen for their consistency, stitched with sinew that will not loosen in rain. Spears are forged shorter for thrusting, the hafts sealed with rubbed fat so they do not crack. These choices are not made in a single afternoon, they are made by repeated testing. Men stand in circles with shields pressed together, listening to the dull thud of impact, learning to anticipate the rhythm of thrusts leaning out from the circle's edge. They practice stepping through thorn and grass, shifting weight to avoid the slide that will pull a man down in the wrong moment. Drill is a way of disciplining attention. It begins with objects, shield, spear, sandals, and ends by selecting which emotions may be allowed out at which times. You do not remove fear, you schedule it. You do not abolish anger, you ration it. Parallel to this, homesteads adjust to contribute without debilitation. Women, whose labor is the ballast of the circle, expand fields by half a furrow here and another there. They experiment with the slope and aspect of plots, choosing patches that dry a little slower in the wind or warm a little faster in the morning. Grain bins are plastered more neatly, their openings sealed with a care that would make any treasurer proud. Beer brewing is paced to serve meetings and musters. The taste is calibrated, the pots are cleaned completely, because a bad brew can ruin a negotiation and waste a season's goodwill. If you are tempted to describe power as only a function of weapons, watch a brewing day proceed correctly and then imagine it failing. The correction would cost you in time, in trust, in the patience others will extend next time a call goes out for help. Relations beyond the immediate confederation are maintained by leaps of courtesy and careful silence. No one declares a boundary with a line on the ground. They declare it by repeating the walk between certain homesteads, by escorting messengers to exactly the same tree, stump, or stream crossing every time. The route becomes the signature. Gifts pass back and forth, accompanied by speeches whose phrasing has been polished by use. The words carry the weight of memory, phrases everyone recognizes and therefore trusts. In this way, new patterns form without feeling new. Those who dislike novelty are reassured there is nothing here to dislike. Those who thirst for speed are pleased to find that tasks once done in weeks can now be done in days. Trade inches deeper into the inland circles. Beads are not merely tokens, they organize mood. Colors begin to standardize meanings across broader distances, making it easier to negotiate marriages and to signal intentions at festivals. Ironwork sharpens. A modest improvement, a better charcoal that burns hotter, a new bellows technique that holds pressure longer, leads to a wave of tools with slightly better edges. The effect appears mundane until you measure it in farm chores done before the sun reaches a particular mark in the sky. Better edges mean earlier returns to other tasks. Earlier returns means surplus time. Surplus time is the raw material of politics. With it, one can attend meetings without the nagging sense that something essential at home is sliding toward neglect. Within the circle of training, young men discover a new calendar layered over the old. They learn that planting, weeding, and harvest are now punctuated by musters and inspections. They are lodged at times in amakanda, barracks that function like enlarged homesteads organized for youth cohorts. The amakanda are not merely sleeping places, they are workshops, kitchens, and courts of minor discipline. Food arrives from families in scheduled contributions, a flow of sorghum, millet, and dried meat that must be tracked and verified. The counting is public because transparency smooths suspicion. Elders serve as eyes and ears, ensuring that this new institution does not become a hidden appetite out of step with the homesteads feeding it. The rule holds, if a thing cannot be explained in daylight, it should be reconsidered. You notice, too, the careful management of expectations. The organizers of this system know the dangers of promising too much. They do not say that discipline will prevent drought. They say that it will help people move together quickly when drought arrives. They do not say that alliances will prevent raiding. They say that the response to raiding will be sharp and limited, reducing the spread of panic. Practical humility keeps the project clean of superstition and exaggeration. Ritual continues as ever, a respect for ancestors, the quiet asking for guidance, but it coexists with the new emphasis on measurable performance, whether a message arrives in an afternoon or by the following day, whether a shield wall holds for a count of breaths, whether a march reaches its point before the sun dips behind a certain shoulder of hill. From the north, pressure builds in ways that are felt first in the ankles and lungs, the measures of marching men. The Nwandwe, formidable in their own right, are watching the weave of these new patterns just as carefully. In the interstices you see an arms race of logistics rather than metal. Who can move faster on known paths? Who can secure water points? Who can predict hunger and avoid it by a single day? Leaders become connoisseurs of timing. Even the decision to pursue an enemy is a calculation that includes the dryness of grass, the availability of shade for a midday halt, and the condition of sandals. A commander who neglects sandals will not survive long because feet given blisters by neglect are a slower fate than any spear. The coastline is a distant hum in this inland music, but its effects are cumulative. People begin to expect certain kinds of cloth and certain bead shades as normal, and expectations have a way of hardening into needs once enough seasons pass. The flows of goods make certain nodes more important, market centers by custom rather than decree. Gathering there, people absorb and spread rumor like dust and pollen. Out of rumor, leaders construct caution and opportunity. They make lists who among neighboring headmen is flexible, who is proud, who is cautious, who is provoked by small slights. These lists are recited at night, revised in the morning after someone has remembered a correction, lying down with their head on a rolled blanket, listening to cattle settle. In this tightening world, the name Zulu is still one among many until events catalyze it into prominence. You could say that the catalyst is a series of fights, but that would be a shorthand that hides the work. The true catalysts are the patient disciplines that permit fights to matter decisively, the regularity of musters, the rise of reliable messengers, the willingness of households to accept small pauses in marriage cycles so that regiments can be managed. Even as the personal story of a leader becomes interesting to those who love to condense history into biography, the larger story remains logistical. Men sleep in certain places at regular times and wake with tasks. Women synchronize grain stores to feed both homestead and cohort. Iron, leather, wood, and fiber are shaped to consistent standards. When consistency is achieved across dozens of homesteads, a network becomes a machine. There are frictions. Some elders resist the delay of marriages, arguing that households should be formed when gifts and hearts are ready, not when a schedule permits. Some homesteads complain about the burden of food contributions, especially after a mean harvest. Some headmen fear that young men who live too long away from the circle will forget its courtesies and return as blunt instruments rather than considerate sons and brothers. These are not trivial fears. The organizers adjust. Marriages are permitted in bands. Contributions are scaled by the measure of visible harvest rather than rumor. Visitations home are scheduled to prevent a sense of severance. If the machine is to run, it must be greased with fairness more than fear. There are also changes at the edges of the map you carry in your head. Movement becomes more common. Groups pack households onto ox-drawn sledges, shift cattle along tried paths to avoid known patches of disease, and seek the protective umbrella of stronger networks. This movement is not always panic. Often it is prudent repositioning, a practice long known, now accelerated by the sense that events are flowing faster than before. This speed persuades some to join the system willingly and provokes others to break away to quieter valleys. The world does not compact into a single block without protest, but the strongest current runs in the direction of organization, and the names of its channels will be remembered because they fit into the mouths of those who marched. Meanwhile, the calendar retains its older demands. Rains must still be watched for. They are not under command. The quiet rituals of asking the ancestors for aid continue in a language untouched by new drills. A woman stepping into a garden with a hoe still makes the same small adjustments in how she holds her tool to avoid wrist pain. A man returning cattle to the kraal at dusk still counts without seeming to count, recognizing missing heads by the shape of a herd before numbers cross his mind. These continuities make the new possible. Without them, there would be no base upon which to set the weight of ambition. When you try to pinpoint the moment a name becomes a magnet that pulls other names toward it, you risk mistaking a symbolic scene for the accumulating facts behind it. It might have been a victory on a hill where the clever use of ground and water confused a stronger foe. It might have been the smooth acceptance of authority by reluctant neighbors after an opponent's leader vanished from the scene. But the more accurate truth is simpler. A network that had learned to behave like a single thing finally decided to believe it was a single thing. Membranes hardened, routines became rules, preferences became orders. The homestead circles still spun, but their rotation was now timed by an outside clock. When you sit at dusk, as light dwindles and cattle breathing turns the kraal into a low, warm chorus, you understand that promises made to families are the hinge upon which the whole apparatus turns. The promise is not about glory, it is about steadiness. Protection from petty raiding, fair adjudication of disputes, cattle redistribution in measured drought, opportunities for young men to prove themselves in ways that return them home wiser and still attached to their elders. If these promises can be kept, a more formal kingdom can rise without tearing out the roots. If they cannot, the machine will chew its own parts, and so you end this portion where it properly ends, with a question not about who commanded on which day, but about how trust, grain by grain, pot by pot, hide by hide, was poured into a larger vessel. As the shape of a kingdom comes into focus and the lines between homesteads draw tighter, you are left to wonder, at the moment when the machine finally starts to hum, how do those who feed it ensure that it will not, one day, decide to forget the quiet circles that allowed it to be built at all? You step forward into a time when decisions stiffen into precedent, and precedent into the bones of a state. You no longer look at a loose association of circles. You look at lines of men moving at a pace that no longer requires the kindness of songs to keep them together. There is still music, but it is choreographed to the needs of drill. The Amakanda have multiplied and have begun to feel like small towns, ordered huts, central spaces for assembling, racks for shields, and designated places for the storage of spears and clubs. The smell in these places is new and familiar at once: sweat and leather, cooked grain, iron and wood smoke. Young men stand in age sets, their bodies marked by the collective diet of training, lean, strong, coordinated. They are watched by eyes trained to catch slackness as it is born. They joke, but on time. They rest, but not when they choose. You understand that leisure here is not an absence of obligation, it is scheduled recovery, a tool in a larger program. Around them, women sustain the tempo. The food that arrives does so through a series of transactions that must feel fair to remain stable. A homestead that sends more than it can afford expects favor when the time comes for cattle redistribution or for the resolution of a dispute. A homestead that sends less does not expect public scolding, but senses itself observed more closely. The accounting is partly spoken, partly carried in glances at meetings where the quantity and quality of contributions can be seen without comment. These balances are maintained the way a cook manages a fire, rarely by moving all the wood, often by shifting a single stick. The work of iron is now a concern of leadership. Consistency matters. Smiths receive specific instructions about the dimensions of spearheads and the thickness of their shoulders. A too slender blade snaps, a too thick blade refuses to slide properly into the gap that forms between wooden shield rim and leather in the instant after a strike. The hafts are carved from selected woods, dried correctly to avoid warping, and sanded with patience to avoid friction burns in a tired hand. You notice that the detailed choices are taken from experience gained in small fights and folded back into the production cycle. Mistakes are notes. Notes become rules. Rules are taught without flourish. The calendar of musters is now interleaved with a broader schedule of integration. Groups incorporated into the emerging kingdom are not merely conquered, they are taught to belong. The policy is purposeful because its opposite, permanent spoils, tends to endless resistance. So conquered homesteads receive new placements within the age-set system. Young men of different origins are mixed, taught to see one another as cohort mates rather than rivals. Marriage arrangements are seeded that tie former opponents to new patrons. Honor is distributed in speeches that carefully use names, kinlinks, and promises of future support. These are not poetic inventions, but repairs as practical as rethatching a roof after wind. You are reminded again that rhetoric is a tool of logistics as crucial as a spear in maintaining the flow of the project. When war comes in earnest, it is not the grand spectacle that matters most, but the ability to hold formation on ground that is not cooperative. There is a hill with a gentle slope and a river too shallow to dignify itself with the name. The ground offers sparse cover and the sun is ordinary. What makes the day decisive is the way men are placed and kept placed, the center holding, the flanks moving around like the horns of an animal, the reserve waiting without fidgeting for the moment when their weight will matter. If you listen to the shouted orders, they are few. If you watch the men, they are trained to watch one another, and the flag-like shields that indicate where the line sits, where it bends, and where it needs stiffening. The victory is not breathtaking, it is careful. It is the kind of victory that teaches the machine to trust itself. Defeat and vulnerability also teach. There are nights after which a count of men returns a number that is lower than morning's hopes. There are spears broken more quickly than expected. There are sandals worn through because someone mismeasured the distance. These miscalculations are documented not with ink, but with altered routines at the next muster, more attention to the thickness of souls, a heavier emphasis on the reserve's patience, a revised allocation of water carriers, a new habit of sending scouts not at dawn but before. If you follow each change from error to correction to habit, you can see the skeleton of a state forming, a structure that knows how to learn. There are costs. The delay of marriages creates pressure that must be vented with skill. Older men worry that lineages might thin if young men serve too long before forming households. The solution is rarely an edict. It is a series of exceptions made public and then quietly generalized. Certain cohorts are released for marriage in bands, timed to gaps in the campaign schedule. Elders are invited to publicize the advantages: stronger sons, richer cattle, more secure homesteads. In the short term, the organization asks for patience. In the long term, it promises a thickened security that will permit plentiful households to flourish. Whether these promises are kept depends on how steady the next seasons will be. At the edges, fear travels faster than facts. Refugees move, sometimes fleeing real horrors, sometimes preempting imagined ones, sometimes choosing to align with a strong center by coming nearer to it willingly. You observe lines on the ground that are actually currents of people and cattle, the grooves laid down by repeated movement. A term becomes fashionable to explain the upheaval, something like the scattering caused by crushing. But if you walk along these currents, you see more than crushing. You see strategic relocation, alliance-seeking, and the mundane relocation that drought alone could have provoked. This matters because explanations, once settled, are hard to shift. The truly boring truth is that many causes layered together to produce a landscape of movement. Politics accelerated what climate and competition would have done anyway. The inside of the machine also moves toward consolidation of authority. Leader, whose name will become a shorthand for the entire project, now exercises a range of controls that reach into the texture of life. He listens for disloyalty, but also listens for inefficiency. He is proud of drill, but prouder of supply arriving intact. He tests the limits of his reach and sometimes overreaches, demanding too much obedience in spheres where custom prefers consultation. When he errs, he pays in trust. When he corrects, he regains authority. His admirers focus on innovation in weapons and tactics. His enemies point to harshness and arrogance. The truth is less polar. He is an editor of a living system, and editing a living thing is always messy. You feel in the rhythms of the amakanda and the murmurs in homesteads that the project is sustainable only so long as the edits do not cut into the bone of the circle. Events rearrange the surrounding chessboard. A rival leader falls, another appears. Allies become weaker than expected. A last-minute substitute secures success when plans wobble. The machine adapts. It commits to a perimeter that is not a line on a map, but a zone of influence described in speeches, in tribute, and in who arrives when called. Tribute in cattle becomes one way to measure the map's shape. When cattle from a valley are late or thin, the problem is not only animal husbandry, it might be political coolness. Envoys travel with their eyes trained to see such symptoms and their mouths trained to cure them with tact. The choice of envoy is itself an art, a man known for fairness rather than sharpness, a woman whose marriage links make her a bridge rather than a wedge. You begin to taste the texture of the centralization in predictable places, the timing of festivals, the protocol for greeting at court, the spacing between inspections, the habit of officers to split cohorts for specific tasks without losing their identity. After a while, practices feel like customs, and customs feel like nature. That is how any state solidifies, by exhausting the imagination of alternatives. The young take it for granted that they will live part of their lives away from home. The old accept, with varying degrees of resignation and pride, that their authority now passes through outer channels before it returns to the circle. Still you find in the spaces between huts that the homestead tries to keep its sovereignty. Elders maintain small rituals of independence. They decide the order in which pots will be filled at mealtime. They keep the keys to grain bins literal or figurative. They host reconciliations under trees where the state's eye cannot see as clearly. These practices are not rebellious. They are preservative, like the salt rubbed into a hide to keep it from spoiling. A kingdom that ignores them will grow brittle. A kingdom that respects them will remain flexible. The best leaders lean into flexibility because it reduces the need for spectacular shows of force. You know how the arc of a story like this bends in conventional telling. It names the decisive victories and the moment of final consolidation. It then pivots to the leader's fate, to the jealousy in his house, to the stab in the shadow that returns the project to other hands. You could tell it that way. It happened. Ambition makes enemies. Caution makes rivals. Power's circle, once tight, is pierced by those who know its tempo from within and can time their blow. The coup, when it arrives, is unglamorous. Its aftermath is administration, deciding how much of the machinery will continue and how much will be softened. The knives used that day are sharp. The policies that follow are even sharper because they must cut without drawing blood that will stain the project forever. But because this is the boring history that keeps you company as you drift towards sleep, you linger on the administrative continuity. The age sets remain, the amachanda remain. Women still brew beer for inspections, couriers still run, cattle are still counted at dusk. The leadership has changed, but the skeleton holds, because it is built from bones grown in many bodies. The name of the kingdom is said with pride by some and with resignation by others, but it is said the same way, as a fact etched into the ordinary. The state is now an object people carry even when they do not talk about it, in the way they plan marriages, in how they measure contributions, in how boys look toward the amakanda when they begin to imagine themselves as men. As the new ruler adjusts the balance of fear and fairness, you can see the entire apparatus preparing for a future in which it will rub against other kinds of power. Rumors circulate of strangers with fire tubes and red jackets, of horses ridden in close formation, of talkers who draw lines on paper and insist the lines are real. The machine that has learned to turn circles into lines will soon meet a machine made of maps and metal. Before that collision, you pause on a small domestic detail, a woman tightening a thatch stitch with a practiced pull, sealing a seam against the coming rain. The stitch holds because it is neither too loose nor too tight. In that measure is a lesson the state will need when it encounters pressures unlike any it has known. You end this story where it should end, in the overlap between repetition and change. The name has solidified, the lines hold, the circles spin. You can trace the system from homestead to barracks to court and back again, and you can feel both pride and worry in the hearts of those who sustain it. Pride because they have built something that changes the rules in their favor. Worry because every system creates its own vulnerabilities. The question that lingers, the one you carry into the dark, is this. When the structure that grew from the homestead meets structures foreign to its memory, will its strength be the stubbornness of its routines, or will its strength be the ability to bend without breaking? How will it know which to choose? You need to slow the camera and watch a single day in an amakanda, because that day explains the entire machine. You wake before light, not to a bugle, but to a chorus of human movement, the rustle of mats, the almost silent conversation practiced by men who live together and have no need to raise their voices. A pot stirs in the kitchen circle. Steam rises. Breakfast is not indulgence. It is measured fuel, porridge thick enough to carry you to midday without turning the stomach during exertion. The officer walks the perimeter with an eye for small failures, loose lashings, a shield left leaning at the wrong angle, a spear whose haft looks dry. Orders are not shouted. They are given in a tone that assumes compliance, because compliance is the habit that fills the space long before punishment arrives. Inspection is a language. The officer's gaze reads a man's readiness in his knees, in the angle of his shoulders, in the way he responds to the small weight of a hand placed on a shield rim. Shields are checked for tension. The rawhide cords that lace them are wetted and tightened as needed, knowing that later heat will shrink them to the right firmness. Leather has memory. So do men. The leather must be reminded each morning who it is. So must the men, through drills that begin slowly and accelerate, allowing muscles to warm, breath to deepen, and minds to climb into the box of attention, where they will spend most of the day. Drill is as much about leaving things out as it is about putting things in. You are taught to ignore the distractions that would unmake a line, the panic at an unexpected noise, the itch at the edge of the elbow where a spear's shaft has rubbed, the impulse to look left when the right flank shifts. Instead, a man learns to look into the face of the shield in front of him and to read its movement like a script, stepping into the gaps when they open, stiffening the curve when it softens. Commands are few, corrections are constant. This limits the need for theatrics. There is a quiet pride in executing a precise turn, in hitting a mark on the ground with your heel, in feeling the unit's center hold, because your body has become a reliable instrument in a larger apparatus. Between drills, maintenance is the discipline that keeps periods of exertion sharp. You oil leather with a mixture you know by smell, a scent that means the shield will flex and not crack. You polish spearheads with a grit that removes the faint bloom of rust that appeared overnight, a skin that, if ignored, will thicken. You bind sandals, checking that the thong that loops between toes will not tear under a rush. You sweep your sleeping space, not because dust bothers you, but because order in small places breeds order where it matters. You repair your mat. You tighten the binding on your small bundle of personal goods. You drink water when told. Hydration is not left to whim, because thirst ignored at 8 in the morning calls in its debt at noon when the body is needed to obey without negotiation. Communication is a drum you cannot hear unless you look for it in movement. Messengers come and go carrying words that have been shaved of ambiguity. They run the same routes so that the distance can be measured in expectation. A message left at first light arrives by midday if the path is clear. The meaning of a delayed runner is itself a message. Officers discuss these timings in a quiet ring, drawing rough maps in dust with a stick. The maps are erased with a flat sweep of the palm, not to hide secrets so much as to underscore the idea that the map lives in their memory and can be redrawn anywhere. The habit of memorizing details, streams, tree clumps, a rock that looks like a crouched animal is the literacy of this world. It makes roads unnecessary even when they exist. Food is an economy. The porridge changes thickness when grain is short. The portions are scaled without announcement to stretch supplies. A new delivery from a distant homestead arrives with a boy, his eyes wide at the sight of men living so close together. He stares. He is allowed to. He will take a story home about order and precision, and that story is as useful as any spear in persuading his elders that this machine is worth feeding. The cooks are chosen as carefully as officers because a bad cook can wreck morale faster than a fierce inspector. They measure salt with their fingers, test doneness by pressing the porridge against the pot's curve with a carved stick. The way they move is itself a drill. Punishment exists and is unromantic. Lateness costs chores. Negligence costs sleep. Excessive harshness is as dangerous as laxity, and officers know it. They calibrate correction to keep the line tight but not brittle. A brittle line shatters. The point is not to break men and rebuild them. The point is to condense their reliability and elasticity into a standard that can be counted on. Rewards also exist, less dramatic than you expect. A favored man is allowed a bit more time to visit home, or his name is praised in a circle where everyone hears, or his shield is given a place where it will be seen by others. Honor circulates like a currency that loses value if issued too freely. The day contains practice for contexts outside the battlefield. Negotiation is rehearsed in mock debates where men argue positions with courtesy, learning to speak across networks without spilling into insult. Diplomacy is a skill inside the barracks because men who will one day carry messages to reluctant headmen must be able to choose the right word without being coached. You watch these exercises and understand that the machinery of order is not only about moving together, it is about speaking in ways that give others room to agree. There is a temptation to romanticize the ferocity of warriors. Resist it. The machine stays supplied by the skill of men who can be fierce in the morning and tactful in the afternoon. Evenings are the release valve. Songs rise, but their content is not only boasting. Many are reminders set to melody. How to step, when to strike, where to hold in the line. The repetition does not bore, it calms. It replaces the minor anxieties of the day with the predictable comfort of shared sound. The body relaxes into the rhythm it will need tomorrow. You are told small stories, short and edgeless, about minor errors corrected, about cleverness shown by an officer, about a cook who saved a pot of porridge by sensing the flames shift. These stories knit men together in the expectation that tomorrow will be more of the same, improved by increments so small that no one notices the improvement until, looking back, they see how smooth the machine has become. Outside the Amakanda, the roads are not roads. They are threads made by repeated choice. Villages along those threads anticipate the arrival of messengers by the angle of the sun. A woman draws water a little earlier because she expects an officer to ask for a pot. A child is told to keep the goats away from the path at certain hours. These small accommodations are the fabric into which the machinery is woven. If you tried to pull the machine out, the fabric would tear. If the fabric tears, the machine loses the gentleness that keeps it powerful. It would escalate to force too quickly and stay in the air like a raised arm with no place to fall. You are tempted perhaps to ask whether fear is the glue. It is a component. No one denies that. But fear alone cannot manage the long haul of administration. What you see in the day of the barracks is discipline extended by trust. Trust that the porridge will not be burnt, that the leather will not crack, that the messenger will arrive, that drills will start and end on time, that a small error will be treated as a small error. The men sleep under this trust as under a blanket. They wake in it. It makes their movements quiet and their obedience fluid, and it keeps resentment from gathering into something sharp enough to cut. Night brings inspection again, softer this time. The officer walks the circle, listening more than looking, sensing restlessness like a change in the weather. He notes it for tomorrow. Perhaps drills should be shorter, perhaps maintenance needs more attention, perhaps a cohort is ready to be tested in the field. He does not write it down. He tells himself once, twice, makes a small rhyme to hold it in his head if he must. This manner of keeping knowledge inside the person is also part of the machinery. It makes the system resilient to the loss of paper and knife-proof maps. If a man falls, his replacement holds the same rhymes. The day ends with a question, and that is fitting because questions move machines more subtly than orders. As the embers turn red and then black, you are left to wonder. In a system calibrated so finely that a loose thong on a sandal can ruin an afternoon's precision, what protects the whole from the single moment when a greater looseness, born of pride, of haste, of misread signals, might slip through the fingers and make the morning's confidence into the evening's regret. You begin by following a runner instead of a regiment, because a state is only as fast as its messages. He rises at first light, touching the ground as if asking permission, then eats a handful of porridge that was left for him in a small calabash near the hearth. He ties his calfskin wrap tight, presses his feet into sandals with straps he repaired the night before, and checks the tiny bag at his waist where the knotted thong bears the memory of his errand. The route is already in his body. He knows where the path drops into shade and where it will glare. He knows where the thorn will lean over the path like an unanswered question and where the stream can be crossed with dry ankles. He will run alone for a part of the morning and then meet another at a place that is only a place by custom. A tree with a broken branch, a flat stone that gives back a particular sound. When a heel taps it, the mouth of a little gully you would ignore if you did not need it. At that point, the message moves on unchanged. The man behind will not rest long. He will run back with news of safe passage, and someone, somewhere, will adjust a plan by a few hours, which often prevents the need for any plan at all. Orders make a state, but the state holds because of law, and law here does not live in a book. It lives in memory and in the cool places where elders sit and listen to the complaint that a man brings, not with a flourish, but with a careful arranging of details. A woman says that the cattle promised with her marriage have not all arrived. An old man says he was insulted by a neighbour's boy. A headman complains that a small path has been blocked by newly planted sorghum. These are the matters that accumulate into the feeling of fairness or its absence. You watch a hearing and understand that the choice of who speaks first is already judgment. A fair court is a precise engine. One witness follows another. A break is called when tempers quicken. Beer is poured in cups that suggest nothing. Verdicts are not dramatic. They are spoken with the gravity of knowing that law here is a patchwork, quilt, sewn from precedent, and that any cut today will fray tomorrow's edge. If you ask how a ruler's will reaches into these circles, the answer is that it arrives by tone. Officers carry the habit of order into the hearing, keeping the conversation from spiraling into insult, reminding everyone that a larger peace surrounds the smaller injury. The roads do not exist on paper, and yet you can map them by the way pots are placed and fires banked. A household that expects a party of soldiers to pass will keep water ready and wood near the hearth. The daughter who tends the pot will keep the porridge thicker because it travels better. In return, the soldiers will lean their shields in a way that does not crush the fence, and they will step around the small, soft dirt that marks a child's play. You think this trivial until you see how such small recognitions prevent resentment from corroding cooperation. The state depends on an etiquette between strangers. It is taught not by proclamation but by repetition. Soldiers who fail at it find themselves correcting latrines or fetching water. Officers who ignore it lose the mood of the countryside faster than they lose a skirmish. Supply is a dull word until you stand in a storehouse and watch how time is put in jars. Grain is piled in bins with a curve as neat as a potter's eye could draw. The openings are sealed with clay that holds the palm print of the woman who smoothed it. Dried meat hangs in strips that have learned the lesson of air and shade. The racks are placed where wind will pass, not where sun will scald. Salt is kept in small bags, measured, never guessed. You could call this housekeeping, and you would be right. The barracks learn from the homestead, not the other way around. When a cohort arrives, the storehouse breathes out. When it leaves, the storehouse is replenished with contributions arriving according to a schedule no one writes down and no one forgets. A clerk of sorts exists in each place, an old man with a memory that has been trained by decades of harvest and hunger. He will know if someone has sent less than they should have sent, and he will know whether the reason is shortage or bad faith. His word will weigh more than any officer's suspicion. Spies and scouts are not the cloaked figures of stories. They are men who pass with ordinary purpose and see more than they say. They measure the number of fires in a camp by the size of the smoke in morning light and the way it lies in the valley. They estimate the number of cattle by counting dung circles near a water point, each circle telling how many animals came to drink at a particular hour. They note new paths being beaten into ground that used to be unmarked. They listen in markets, without appearing to listen. Their reports are lean, stripped of the vanity of anecdote. Leaders who want the embroidery of boastful detail will hear nothing useful. Those who prefer bone over fat will know enough to move. The craft of spying is the craft of not being noticed. It attracts men who value the quiet satisfaction of being believed by someone whose decisions will move hundreds. Tax is collected in respect more than in coin. The token of acknowledgement is cattle or grain brought on time. The courtship of compliance is public dignity. The man who arrives with 3 head of cattle is greeted by name, and the animals are praised in terms that a cattleman knows how to hear. Such words matter. They recognize the work behind the payment. They also secure the next payment. A rude collector empties the next calabash by his rudeness. A courteous one fills the next storehouse by his restraint. You want the state to be strong? Then you want it to be careful, because carefulness holds more than ferocity ever can. Punishment, when it must appear, is staged in a way that teaches law without feeding spectacle. A thief is made to return goods and to work for the injured family. The work is supervised and the food is measured to be enough, not generous. A headman who withholds contributions is called to a public place where he must explain himself while his elders listen, and he must listen when they tell him he has embarrassed them. Shame is a currency as measurable as cattle. It settles accounts that fines would only inflame. Death is rare as a tool of policy, used in cases where leaving a man alive would keep the disorder alive. A state that kills lightly burns its own seed. The discipline of the regiments extends outward into a discipline of space. Fields are sometimes relaid in a pattern that eases the movement of men and cattle in times of alarm. Paths are widened by use, and certain bottlenecks are recognized as potential traps to be avoided or defended. The names of hills and gullies acquire layers. The old name that speaks of a tree, the newer name that speaks of a fight, the newest name that speaks of a lesson learned. You can follow the layers like rings in a tree trunk and read the growth of authority in the additions. The ruler's job is not merely to order, it is to remember and to make remembering useful. Diplomacy is practice in rule-bound speech. When envoys go out, they do not improvise. They carry formulae that have room for courtesy and none for insult. They perform respect with an exactness that is itself a strength, the right number of claps, the right timing of praise names, the right proportion of direct request to oblique suggestion. You could mistake this for flattery. It is not. It is a grammar, and it keeps the language of negotiation from being polluted by the fever of a moment. The point is to keep talk within the boundaries where agreement is possible. Those who cross these boundaries are corrected not with anger, but with recalibration. That is how a state keeps friendships from becoming competitions for honor. The ruler at the center uses audiences as a workshop. He listens to complaints from far corners and notices patterns. 3 different headmen speak of cattle sickness near a certain stream. He hears the refrain and sends word to move herds away until the grass recovers. 2 envoys mention a headstrong young man in a valley. He says little, but later chooses to shuffle assignments so that the young man's energy is placed where damage will be minor if he fails and useful if he succeeds. He asks small, specific questions. How many days does it take from that ridge to that water? Which of the smiths near that place has a steady hand? Whose beer at the last festival was praised? More. These are not trivial, they are data. They let him recombine the same parts, men, cattle, skill, place, into arrangements that answer the season's needs. He is not inventing, he is editing what already exists, and his edits must be good enough to survive after he is gone. Shoes, or their substitutes, teach you how finely the machine is tuned. A man's sandals fail, he is pulled from a line because an injured foot is a liability. Officers keep spares, not many, but enough to keep a day's drill from being thrown off by one man's unplanned limp. Sandal makers are as important as shield makers. They use hide that is neither too old nor too new. They cut with attention to grain. They punch holes with a tool that does not tear. They teach young men to tie straps in a way that allows for swelling in the heat of a long march. This detail seems small until you measure how many miles are saved by one fewer blister in a cohort of 100 men. Every field force in history is an anatomy lesson. Here, the feet tell you whether the brain's orders will arrive at the ground in time. Weather is not a topic, it is a partner. Officers teach men to watch clouds for the way they thickness into rain or thin into empty promise. Marches are started early when air is heavy, delayed when the morning wind has the feel of dryness that will make men thirst too early. Porridge is salted more on hot days because salt loss makes brains slow, and slow brains make lines soft. Water carriers are positioned at intervals that change with the temperature. Scouts learn to smell the difference between water that is safe to drink and water that will punish the bowels. There are no thermometers. There is no barometer. There is an intimacy with the sky that comes from a life lived outdoors, and this intimacy is more valuable than a shelf of instruments to those who must decide when to move. It is tempting to look backward and forward at the same time, to draw a line from these quiet efficiencies to the coming collisions with powers, whose roads are made of iron and whose messages ride telegraph wires. But staying within this moment, you see a completeness that does not feel temporary to those living it. The regiments are full of men whose identities are attached to their age sets and to the promises they have made to one another. The homesteads are fields of competence that restock and mend the machine without being commanded to do so each time. The law is a habit of fairness that people defend, not out of fear of punishment, but in the hope of sleeping without dispute, gnawing the edge of the mat. The ruler speaks and is obeyed, but it is the kind of obedience that feels like participation by those obeying. They are not cogs, they are contributors whose work is recognizable and recognized. A single fear runs under the order. The fear that the machine's appetite might outgrow the patience of those who feed it. The ruler must know when to call men back to their homesteads, when to let the festivals breathe, when to allow marriages to go forward in a season crowded by other needs. He must know when to make an example and when to let an injury pass unmarked. He must know when to add a new regulation and when to retire an old one quietly. He must know when to borrow from the prestige of rules and when to let custom carry the day. If he forgets these measures, the machine will still move, but it will move with a clatter that will carry over ridges and down valleys, warning neighbors and tiring friends. At dusk, you stand in a place where three paths meet and watch the light drain from the day. You have seen the engine's parts, the runner, the storehouse, the court, the barracks, the envoy, the artisan, the cook, the sandal maker. You have watched them fit into one another with the ease of repetition. You have also felt the human weight of all of it, the way each task answers a need without declaring itself heroic. If you are asked what makes a kingdom, you answer, these ordinary tasks timed and tuned until they form a music. And then a quieter thought arrives, a question that keeps you honest as you turn for home. If a kingdom is a music of ordinary tasks, what single wrong note let to repeat for too long might begin to detune the whole, and who would be the first to hear the change? You are told to pay attention to the hum around a name because it tells you how authority circulates. The name in the center, uttered with praise by some, with caution by others, belongs to the editor of this machinery, a man whose reforms are often described as if they leapt from his head fully formed. But you know better. You have watched him arrange the furniture of custom in a room built by others. He shortens the spears to make thrusting more decisive, enlarges and thickens the shields to make the line less brittle, tightens the schedules so that the calendar of age sets locks neatly into the seasons of agriculture. His fame grows not because he invents from nothing, but because he is patient with detail and ruthless with delay. He visits the barracks and does not make speeches. He watches and corrects. He hears a case and does not thunder. He weighs and chooses. He walks with officers who know when to speak and when to keep their chests quiet. The danger of a system that works is that it provokes belief in its necessity. The ruler begins to see exceptions as enemies and enemies as proof that he must press harder. He finds himself tempted to resolve ambiguities with personal will rather than procedural patience. You understand that this temptation is the tax on success. The amakanda expand, the clocks tighten, young men wait longer to marry, and some begin to chafe. Elders, proud at first that their sons are part of a mighty design, find resentment seeping in when their household rhythms are bent too far, too often. The ruler meets these murmurs not always with reassurance. Sometimes he meets them with a new drill, a sharper order, a punishment that seeks to teach by fear rather than example. Each such moment works in the short term. Each leaves a scar in the long term. A machine that runs too tight begins to burn its oil. At court, an architecture of vigilance grows. The ruler tests loyalty with small provocations. He moves officers like pieces on a board to see who complains and who adjusts. He cultivates men whose virtue is reliability and demotes those whose virtue is originality, because originality is often disobedience warmed by success. He sets spies to watch those who might set spies. He does not neglect the rituals that nourish the belief of the people, ceremonies honoring the ancestors, festivals that pulse with the steady breath of drums, but he tends to conduct them as inspections rather than celebrations. You can see how this would happen. A man who has built his authority from observation and correction will be reluctant to treat any gathering as merely joyous. He will search it for fault, and in searching he will find fault, and in finding he will correct. The cycle improves the surface and stiffens the depth. In the amakanda, pride and strain live side by side. Men march in formations that feel like a second skin. They live with a confidence in one another that comes only from repetition and care. They also count the years and feel the itch of deferred households. Officers carry the responsibility of translating the ruler's ambition into routines that do not crush the men's morale. They adjust the length of drills, they shuffle the order of inspections, they advocate quietly for release of cohorts into marriage when they sense the line stretching thin. It is a delicate role, advocates to the ruler and guardians to the men, interpreters between the language of command and the dialect of endurance. When they succeed, the machine sings. When they fail, the friction becomes audible in the hard laughter of men who have begun to be sardonic about their own precision. Law holds, but tightens. The habit of settlement in the homestead courts continues, but more matters are now escalated to the center. The ruler insists on a more uniform application of punishment. He exerts a preference for his own envoys to mediate disputes that have symbolic weight. Standardization brings fairness of a kind. It also flattens the local wisdom that sometimes solves a problem by walking around it rather than through it. You who have watched the old men smooth disputes like a hand smoothing. A blanket, see the loss and worry. A blanket pulled too tight will tear when someone rolls over in sleep. Beyond the horizon, rivals do not sleep. A northern adversary rebuilds after a defeat with a seriousness born of humiliation. His men train in their own way with habits that answer to their own geography. The ruler knows this and multiplies his inspections. He wants readiness to be instant, not prompt. He squeezes time, and squeezing time squeezes lives. The machine responds because it is built to respond and because men love to demonstrate competence when it is noticed. Victories follow. The ruler's fame presses outward from the ridges. The world shrinks in the minds of those within the machine. They begin to think of their system as the complete explanation for power in any direction. It is a moment of dangerous confidence because the system is strong but not universal. It answers this place well. It does not answer all places. You hear whispers that have the quality of domestic talk rather than political speech. A brother is angry, a cousin feels slighted. A senior advisor grows tired of being tested, of being suspected for his competence. These are the kinds of currents that do not appear on a map. They run beneath the visible surface of meetings and parades. They thicken when a ruler responds to them with suspicion rather than trust. You can sympathize. A man surrounded by necessity might find trust risky and control safer. You also know that suspicion repays itself with proof. It provokes the very disloyalty it fears. It is boring and important to say that many systems fail from within, not because they are badly designed, but because their designers grow afraid of the improvisational life that any system must contain if it is to survive. The day arrives not with omen, but with the usual noises. The ruler moves through spaces where he is accustomed to command. The men near him, some bound by blood, carry the residue of old loyalty and new doubt. The act that will become the pivot of stories is plain, a killing made possible by intimacy. The knife is a tool like any other. It answers to the hand that grips it. The moment is quick, but the preparation has been long. Fear creates conspiracies. Conspiracies create change. You might expect thunder. There is silence afterward, while the machine senses the empty space where command once stood and waits for instructions that will not come. In the days that follow, continuity is the business at hand. The machinery must not be allowed to stop. New hands steady it. A successor is named, and his first acts are acts of reassurance. He keeps the age-set system. He pays the regiments with words they recognize. He visits the Amakanda and lets men see his eyes do the work of attention. He removes the sharpest edges of discipline in a few places where it had cut too deeply. He asserts his own authority not by tearing down what preceded him, but by editing the edits. He is watched. Those who killed do not sleep. Those who feared the tightness of the previous rule do not relax. People test the new tone by raising questions they had kept under their tongues. Small rebellions appear. They are pacified with a CRI mixture of clemency and speed. The system bends, then resumes its shape. There is a shift in the landscape of power that is more architectural than moral. The new ruler centers himself in a different place, builds a new court with the spaces arranged to his preference. The paths that converge there become the new arteries. Markets and messengers adjust. Festivities are scheduled to reassert rhythm and to insist that life continues. An old name is used carefully, with the respect owed to a predecessor whose shadow must not be allowed to deepen. A new name is spoken with increasing confidence, though you can hear in the way it is said that people are noting the differences along with the similarities. You can follow one cohort through the change. Their drills do not change in number. Their meals do not shift in taste. Their officers, if they are wise, tell them that this is not their business, and then make sure that their business remains purposeful. Men who fret are given tasks. Men who fear are given company. Men who exult are given silence. It is a management of mood, an unshowy art. The machine hums again, a little lower in pitch, perhaps the timbre altered by grief and relief. The nation is still itself in the ways that matter. The cattle still return at dusk, the grain still fattens in the jars, the courts still sit with calm, the envoys still speak in measured praise. At the edges of the territory, the neighbors watch. Some who were wary of the previous ruler's grip now test the boundary with minor raids or with refusals to send tribute on time. The new ruler responds carefully. He knows that a show of strength is necessary, but he also knows that a ruinous campaign is a gift to every headman who fears centralized appetite. He chooses limited theater, a fast strike that punishes a raid, a construction of a new post in a place that signals intent, a marriage that binds a doubtful valley. These choices make sense if you remember that power here rests on the belief that the center will not be reckless. A reckless center must be surrounded with caution. A careful center will be surrounded with cooperation. You picture the machine as a loom where threads cross under the hand of a weaver. The pattern is set, but the hand must remain steady, and the yarn must be neither too dry nor too damp. If the yarn is brittle, the pattern will break. If it is damp, the pattern will sag. The new ruler is not simply less or more than his predecessor. He is differently tuned. He will be measured by whether men sleep well in their barracks and whether women hum as they brew, whether the runners meet on time under the broken branch tree, whether courts dispense law that feels like the old law wearing a cleaner cloak. If these small things remain right, the big things can endure. If these small things go wrong, it will take time before the trouble is seen in parades and battles, and by then it will be expensive to repair. You end with your attention on the ordinary, because that is where the truth has always been. The kingdom has passed through the narrow gate where a death might have broken its back, and it has done so by relying not on shock, but on muscle memory. The instruments, spear, shield, sandal, pot, drum, stick for drawing maps, are still in use. The problem facing the new hand at the center is as simple and as difficult as any in government. How tight can you tune a system whose excellence depends on tension before the wire snaps? And when do you loosen it without losing the song? You begin with a fence line that is not a line but a zone, the border between a kingdom that times itself by seasons and messengers and a colonial frontier that times itself by printed timetables and orders issued from a desk hundreds of miles away. On the British side, a wagon's iron rim clinks against a stone as oxen pull forward, the whip cracking in measured snaps that sound like punctuation. On the Zulu side, a runner passes a message in the shade of a thorn tree, palming a knot that encodes a speech delivered in a tone that knows the weight of custom. Between them lies a river that can be crossed when low, and that insists on courtesy when in flood. You are tempted at first to call one side modern and the other traditional, but the distinction becomes less useful the longer you watch men put order into practice. Both sides are precise. They are precise in different grammars. Years before, the year that will become famous, a logic starts to harden in offices. A plan is drawn. Make a federation from disparate colonies and Boer republics. Secure the frontier. Tidy the map. The Zulu kingdom is marked not as an independent rhythm, but as a problem to be solved in the service of another problem. On the ground, however, the steps toward war are ordinary. A patrol investigates a theft of cattle, a trader complains of a debt unpaid, a magistrate sends an assistant to fix a boundary. Each errand makes a mark on the relationship, and the marks add up to a letter, written in invisible ink, that will show only when heat is applied. The Zulu kingdom continues its own management with unhurried intensity. The regiments remain. The courts sit. The kraals breathe. The messengers run. The ruler's advisers consider the gossip from the border and weigh it against the need to avoid provoking a power whose appetites are not yet fully understood. The kingdom is not ignorant of firearms. It has them in small number, obtained with caution and used sparingly in hunts and for the prestige of a shot that echoes the hills. But its confidence still rests on the human machine it has perfected, the line of shields that holds, the flanking horn that moves like a shadow. Confidence is rational. It has been earned in skirmish and campaign, and yet confidence is also a risk when the terms of the next fight are changing quietly in the background. On the British side, the army builds forward with material care. Engineers measure river fords, carpenters repair wagons and build ponts, quartermasters count flour, tea, bullets, biscuit, and rum. The lists are as long as the attention that keeps them. The red coat is not merely a symbol, it is a uniform that demands cleaning and mending even when a man is far from home. Boots are polished, and that polish matters for morale. Tents are pitched with neatness that looks like an aesthetic preference but is really a discipline. Order in camp reduces disease, makes musters faster, and keeps men restful enough to march when told. You will miss the point if you skip these details. The war is gathered one peg at a time. Paper on the colonial side moves words faster than a runner can move them, but the words are heavy with their own slowness, stacked on top of one another in reports that demand to be read by men who have other things to read. Messages multiply until the important ones are buried. You can see why a general would ride ahead to see for himself and why doing so would sometimes separate him from the data he needs. On the Zulu side, the slowness of messages paradoxically keeps information pure. Less is said, more is memorized. The runner's report is lean. The difference will matter when the pace quickens. One side will suffer from the fog of too much information, the other will suffer from the fog of not knowing a few crucial new things. Along the border, ordinary people construct their survival. A settler family repairs a field after a storm and calculates how many days a wagon must be on the road to bring back a barrel of salt and a small sack of sugar. A Zulu homestead chooses a patch of ground that is less likely to flood and negotiates a marriage that will tie a valley more snugly into its kin network. Both families watch the sky and listen to rumor. Both weigh the cost of a new fence against the need to keep cattle out of the garden. Both sharpen tools, cook food, and plan for a next season that will arrive, whether their politics is stable or not. You should allow these lives into your frame because they are what war will spill into. An ultimatum arrives wrapped in the grammar of formality, demands placed in a sequence that sounds like a cleaning of a ledger. From the British side, it appears an administrative necessity. From the Zulu side, it appears an attempt to reorder. A society by decree, disbanding regiments, altering marriage customs, and opening a border to law that answers to a different sovereignty. The arguments on both sides are coherent inside their own logics. That is the trouble. The Zulu kingdom cannot be expected to unmake the human machine it has invested in. The British cannot easily withdraw a demand once it has been placed in a document and sent under a seal. Paper has its own stubborn dignity, and so does custom. While the exchange of words proceeds, men are trained. On the British side, rifle drill tightens. The order to fire in volley is practiced until the sound becomes a sentence with predictable punctuation. Artillery is schooled to its work: calculate, lay, fire, adjust. On the Zulu side, the shield. War glides forward and back on command. The spear is thrust and withdrawn with the economy of a practiced hand. The flanking horns practice long marches over difficult ground, learning to read the folds of a hillside with their feet. The difference in weapon makes a difference in what the drill must prepare for, but in both systems the habit of doing things correctly when tired is the point. You see again that the first battle is against the human tendency to slack when no one is watching. River crossings become the rehearsal for future complications. Engineers build a pontoon with planks that must be kept dry and ropes that must be spared from chafe. Soldiers learn to coax frightened oxen onto a floating surface that smells wrong to their hooves. On the Zulu side, men practice crossing a river in file, learning where the current will push hardest, where a stick must be placed to find unseen stones, where the bank is least slippery. Each side has an intimate relationship with water. Each will assume that the other is either clumsy or too cautious. Neither assumption will be fully right. Supply lines extend like nerves. On the British side, each mile of road built is a mile that must be guarded. Each wagon that comes into camp is an opportunity for theft or loss. Each empty wagon is a promise that food will soon run out if it does not return laden. On the Zulu side, the line is shorter. The land itself feeds the men in ways that are familiar. A few cattle on the hoof, grain brought from homesteads that have agreed to contribute. You cannot load a volley into a stomach. Both sides understand that men march on their feet, but only one side truly believes that men march on their bellies. Watch who is right in what proportion. News of the ultimatum moves through homesteads in the Zulu countryside in the way that news always moves, through gatherings held for other purposes. A wedding feast pauses to consider a rumor. An argument over a cow's temperament is interrupted by a mention of soldiers near a ford. A market moment lengthens as people ask whether the long preparations are now to be cashed in. The kingdom's experience tells it that it can fight if it must, and that to fight is to accept costs that will be borne by those who did not make the choice. The ruler listens to advisors who balance pride, caution, and practicality. They know the machine is good. They also know that rifles bite differently than spears and that artillery answers to no shield. In colonial circles, the logic of demonstration presses hard. A show of strength is thought to reduce future wars. An expedition is framed as a police operation to enforce a set of reasonable reforms. The language allows everyone to sleep, but it also dulls the sense of what is being undertaken. The men who will march have no illusions. They count miles and rations and are careful about their boots. Their officers vary. Some understand that. The enemy's system is coherent and not merely a mass of bodies. Others believe that steadiness of fire alone will solve any tactical problem. The difference between respect and underestimation is often the difference between preparation and surprise. In the weeks before the first crossing, the border is full of small matters that have huge consequences in aggregate. A storehouse is misplaced by a day's march, and a unit arrives hungry. A guide's memory gets a patch of ground wrong by half a mile, and a path chosen for speed turns into a channel for ambush. A commander spends an afternoon writing a report that will be read by a man who cannot help him in time, and in that afternoon he loses the chance to inspect a picket line that later proves weak. On the other side, a cohort trains a little too hard and runs short of patience. An officer reprimands them sharply, and the men sleep with their pride wounded. These tiny exhalations will become gusts when the storm arrives. You stand on a ridge as the world below begins to move toward collision. The Zulu machine is real in the way a hand is real. You can see how fingers close and open. The British machine is real in the way a mill is real. You can see how gears turn and belts move. Both are efficient in what they were built for. The anxiety is that neither was built for the other. One relies on the shock of mass and the precision of muscle. The other on the shock of powder and the precision of drill. Both rely on supply and communication, and both will find those arteries strained. Before the first shots, before the first horn blows, you leave yourself with a question. If two systems optimized for different problems must share the same ground, which will learn faster while tired and hungry, and will that speed of learning be enough to let competence outrun surprise? You move your eyes slowly across a plain whose name will become a shorthand for astonishment. The slope appears gentle, a hill rises like a sleeping animal, the grass is ordinary. The British camp sits with its lines less tidy than a manual would. Prefer the men confident but stretched by the landscape's broadness. Pickets are out, but the ground is a maze of folds that can hide movement like a cloak hides a knife. The Zulu army moves with a practiced silence, not as a chaotic rush, but as a plan laid onto ground with hands that know the way a line must bend before it can close. The horns extend, the chest holds, the loins, the reserve, wait in patience that is itself a weapon. The first realization for the British officers is not the charge, but the scale. Bodies appear on multiple axes, the sound is a rustle that becomes a roar. The visual field fills. Orders are given, extend the line, bring up ammunition, send messages. To recall detachments, keep fire steady. Fire is steady and it is deadly. Men fall by the dozens at 100 yards, then at 50, then nearer. Reloading is a function of habit. The cartridges must be torn and poured, the rifles shouldered, the sights adjusted. Speed matters. Cleanliness matters. A dirty rifle slows and then fails. Square bullets are indifferent to a man's hope. After a while, though, arithmetic asserts itself. Rounds are expended faster than resupply can move. Companies, spread out, cannot be watered by the wagons quickly pulled by exhausted oxen. The men have trained to stand and fire. They are good at it. They continue. But holes appear between groups as ammunition thins, and as the curiosity of the ground allows an enemy to come close before being seen. For the Zulu, the approach is timed. The chest takes punishment and holds, a test of nerve as much as of body. The horns move to envelop with that long, looping gait that men practice until their legs hold it like a second nature. The reserve waits for the sound that will call them forward. Spears are held correctly. Shields are kept low until the last moment. Officers move with their men rather than ahead of them, guiding by gesture and example. They are killed, many of them, but the line learns to flow around the loss, like water around a stone. When they close, they do not do so in a single rush. They probe, withdraw, probe again. They look for the place where the fire is less intense, the place where a gun crew is tired, the place where a company's officer glances a little too often, to his left instead of to his front. You count time by the rate of firing, by the pace at which men glance behind them for cartridges, by the distance between lines as it changes by a few steps each minute. The British line has lengthened to meet the width of the attack, and in lengthening, it has thinned. Units that have trained to act as a whole find themselves operating in smaller parts. NCOs shout, hands steady shoulders. One man passes cartridges to another in a gesture of trust that will remain forever in memory. An officer looks for a place to anchor a rally. The hill offers nothing but open ground and the feeling of sky too large above. When the horns meet behind, the sound changes. Men who had believed they were pushing an enemy back realize they are being closed upon. The collapse is not general at first. It is local and then contagious. A company finds itself flanked. It turns. The line opens. The next company is exposed. The order to retire comes too late or not at all. Men begin to run, and running through friends creates panic that cannot be calmed by a shout. The Zulu infantry does what it trains to do. It presses into the gaps created by retreat and uses the shield not only to defend, but to push and to trip, turning the careful dance of thrust and withdrawal into close work. Where rifles are clumsy, you know the rest as a list, standards lost, colours saved at cost, men dying far from their little tents, ammunition boxes cursed for their stiffness or their lack, riders sent on missions that will become legends of duty that could not alter. The sum. The hill looks on indifferent, the ground drinks. On the same day, later, a small missionary station becomes a box, scraped into the earth by men with no time and no peaceful purpose. Mealie bags are stacked into walls, biscuit boxes become barricades, tools that were meant for agriculture are pressed into shaping an instant fort. The defenders are not chosen for heroism, they are chosen by presence. Some are ill, some are clerks, some are officers with the habit of command. Some are privates with the habit of obeying. The enemy appears in waves, each tested by bullet, by bayonet, by sheer persistence. Rifles fire more slowly in the dark. Nerves have to be talked down by small words. Men pass cartridges back and forward in a line that is a system born of necessity. The attackers are not ghosts, they are men who have marched hard and fought harder, and now press on a small obstacle not because it is strategic, but because it is in their path and because they have been taught to test everything in their path. You want to be careful about what you praise. What happens at the little station is not the triumph of one system over another. It is the collision of two kinds of discipline in a space where numbers are temporarily evened by the shape of the ground and the stubbornness of men. The defenders are efficient in fire, they rotate positions with a plan that keeps the fire from thinning. They are supplied by a stripped-down logistics that consists of a few men who keep moving even under panic. The attackers are brave and skilled. They test different angles. They keep courage in song and in the press of men who do not want to be seen stepping back. In the end, the balance is tipped by the few inches of wall, by the time bought by each minute of steady firing, and by the exhaustion of men who had run all day and fought all night already. You leave praise to those who need it. Your task is to record the economy that made survival possible: sandbags, biscuit boxes, a measured pass of cartridges, small fires put out, and wounds bound just enough to keep men in the line. Elsewhere, along the broad front, other small events add up. A garrison sits under siege, its men working to keep disease from killing more than bullets, counting food by weeks and then by days, sorting the useful from the useless with a clarity that peace rarely demands. Relief columns make choices that are wetter than maps can show. A river rises, a bridge fails, a commander chooses prudence one day and then is punished by opinion for caution the next. The Zulu army, encouraged by success and aware of the cost of pressing too far into hostile logistics, chooses where to appear and where to vanish. Scouts for each side learn to respect the other scouts, recognizing in the small marks on the ground, the heel here, the turned pebble there, the competence of a mirror. In the wake of the disaster and the small miracle, both systems adjust. The British fix trivial things with serious intent. They change how ammunition is carried, who has authority to break open boxes, how far camps must be lagered against the chance that a day will become like another. They march with more caution, with scouts pushed further, with pickets stationed where the folds of ground hide a mass. The Zulu adjust it their way. They calculate the cost of attacking fortified points. They prefer to meet on ground they can shape rather than at walls their spears cannot chew. They practice patience even when men are flush with the memory of a victory that felt like a vindication of style. You count the dead with no relish. Counting is a duty because numbers have consequences for policy. The Zulu mourn quickly in the field with the rituals they can manage, knowing that grief delayed is grief unresolved. The British bury with a combination of haste and ceremony, aware that the dignity of a body laid into ground is a link in a chain of morale that stretches back to barracks, to boarding houses, to villages across an ocean. The landscape begins to collect graves that will become points on future maps of remembrance. The hills will remember the taste of iron and salt for a while, then forget. Between the famous day and the next famous day, weeks stretch in which men perform routines that war histories often skip. Wagons are repaired, boots resoled, letters written home, with hands that are not made for writing and thoughts that are not made for words, messengers sent with terms that are offers and not yet peace. The Zulu region's homesteads adjust to the absence of men. Women manage cattle with the ease of those who have always known how. Elders take more cases in court. Beer is brewed for rituals of consolation and simple endurance. You do not get the next month without these economies being kept. They are boring to the impatient. They are the entire point to those who must live. One side brings up more guns and more men. The other husbands strength and waits for moments to press. The second act is often a test of humility, whether those who bled before will accept that the next battle will be fought on terms not identical to the last. A system's arrogance can be read in its refusal to change trivial things. Arrogance, after the shock of loss, tends to hide in small habits, refusing to wear a particular piece of kit because it looks foolish, refusing to advance at a different pace because it feels unfamiliar, refusing to take advice from scouts because it comes from men without the right accent. You watch for these refusals like a doctor watches for small fevers. The lantern at the little station goes out when the sun rises on a field littered with the debris of effort. Men sleep in snatches, wake in jerks, and are quiet in the knowledge of having survived something that was not supposed to be asked of them. Across the water and hills, other men sit and puzzle through their own ledger of effort and loss, of honor paid and honor withheld. They too have survived, though not at the little station, and they will carry that survival into the next call. A kingdom that has proven its competence can afford to be cautious. An empire that has tasted embarrassment will be meticulous. Both will move toward the next meeting of systems. You are left with a question that should be ordinary and is not. In the arithmetic of loss and learning, will the side that adapts faster also be the side that remembers to ask whether there is a limit to what must be spent to prove a point that a well-timed pause might have settled? You enter the period where plans are adjusted with an engineer's care. The British bring in columns whose logistics are tightened like drumskins, lagers arranged with textbook neatness, wagons drawn into circles that become instant small forts, pickets placed in numbers that make surprise less likely. Guns move with an awareness of ground they did not show before. Infantry lines practice forming squares not for parade, but for the possibility of horns closing. Scouts are listened to. Engineers are allowed their caution. The word relief is no longer a vague promise, but a timetable with margins built in. Columns coordinate, knowing now that coordination is not the luxury of perfection, but the minimum needed to avoid being plucked in part. The Zulu machine answers by choosing ground. It harasses when the ground is open, presses where an enemy has overreached and relaxed, and refuses to spend itself against box walls of bags and timber that rifles can reduce any brave man upon. Patience becomes strategy. The kingdom watches its own stores, keeps homesteads as intact as possible under the weight of absence, and remembers that feeding next season is as important as winning this week. The ruler listens to advisors who are now part war council, part supply committee, part pastoral consistory, for a people who need words set in the steady cadence of endurance. The courts do not close, the beer still ferments, the cattle still go out and come in on time. In the siege that holds a garrison in place for weeks, routine is life. The trenches are dug, deepened, and kept dry. The drains cut in such a way that disease is less likely to take hold. Rations measured to the ounce and served in a rotation that keeps hunger from becoming despair. The men grow thinner and tougher. They learn to love quiet competence the way boys love songs. Relief comes as a movement in the distance, the dust of a column, the individualized shape of a gun dragged by animals that also need saving, the color that means the system's other half has arrived on time. The gate opens. The inventory is taken. The ledgers of gratitude and complaint are balanced in the way soldiers balance them. With jokes that have teeth and praise that is given on the march. Some of the first columns that push far into the kingdom now carry lessons from the first act, like talismans. They scout the folds of land with care. They force marches only when supply can support it. They keep a reserve whose purpose is not to chase, but to prevent being chased. Their fires are set in patterns that a watcher can read from a distance. Patterns that say we are ready even when asleep. They press through places that were comfortable before and are now contested only in rumor, because rumor has learned caution too. They find the ground where the last act will be performed, and they prepare it with the unromantic work of measurement and clearing. Ulundi, the royal homestead, is not a castle. It is a large, organized circle of life, which is why its destruction will be a symbol beyond its practical effect. The day of battle is clear and chosen. The British fight in a hollow square, a moving geometry built to answer a flanking system with walls of fire on all sides. The Zulu army forms with its own familiar geometry, the horns opening and the chest prepared to absorb and hold. The ground is clear of cover because engineers have learned that grass, brush, and small lips in the soil are the allies of the horn. The square advances with discipline. The guns speak. The rifles maintain a pace of fire learned from books and made real by fear. The Zulu line comes on with the galloping courage that has made it a force for years. It is met by a wall that does not bend. The flanks look for the place where speed might fold the square. They find that an answer has been built that turns every face into a front. The reserve is fed into the place where courage might tear a hole. It does not tear. Horses wheel with lancers whose job is to turn a retreat into a rout. They are less decisive than they were in other countries, more decisive here than anyone thought. The square does not become a stage for human theatre. It remains a worksheet in arithmetic, rate of fire, range, formation integrity, ammunition supply. The result is as clean and as brutal as a sum done correctly. Fire is set to the homestead afterward. The thatch catches with the eagerness that dry grass always shows. The circle becomes a ring of flame. Smoke writes a sentence you can read from far away. People will remember the sight as an ending. It is the end of something, the end of a world where a central circle could be seen as the place from which lines radiated. It is not the end of the people who built that circle. They are already measuring their next adjustments. They are already stepping into the work of living under a different grammar. You watch the administrative follow on with a tired eye. The country is divided into pieces under appointed leaders who must answer to a new centre that does not live in a kraal, but in an office. The logic is familiar to anyone who has ever managed a large household badly. If one pot threatens to boil over, split it into smaller pots. The division creates quarrels where a line does not correspond to how people understand obligation to flow. People who used to be neighbours under one circle now find themselves measured by their compliance with a distant instruction, and compliance becomes a new currency that can be traded for small favours and avoided punishments. It is tidy on paper. It is messy in kitchens. In the short years that follow, disputes among appointed leaders become quarrels among their followers. The old system's ability to resolve conflict with a formula of kinship and cattle exchange is eroded, and the new system's courts do not yet have the habit of legitimacy. There is trouble. A war inside the conquered space breaks out that the conqueror must then manage, a complication not foreseen in the clean shape of earlier plans. The old king returns and is then removed by time and intrigue. A new figure rises, younger, charged with the task of adjusting dignity to a reality no one would have chosen. External protectors and internal ambitions draw lines that the country's own habit of rhythm cannot recognize. In the homesteads, the changes are measured more modestly. A tax is introduced that demands payment not in cattle, but in coin, and coin must be found often by labor far from home. Men leave to work where money can be earned, sending it back in small amounts that must be stretched across seasons. Women extend their skill at management, which was already vast, to cover the absence. Fields are still planted, harvests still brought in, beer is still brewed, ancestors are still spoken to. The words ask for the same things they always asked for: rain in season, peace in the yard, children who grow strong. You see how much of life survives when a political shape changes, and you know this is not a consolation to those who must swallow the new, but it is a truth that keeps the next day from being impossible. On the British side, the campaign's completion is written in reports that fill files. It is memorialized in metal and cloth, in medals and in flags, in speeches that allow a public far away to attach meaning to events they did not sweat for. For some who were there, the meaning is simpler. They survived. Their fellows did not. They did their work correctly when fear made hands clumsy. They watched a system prove itself. For others, the meaning is a question. What does it mean to win a war that leaves you responsible for a place whose ordinary life you do not understand? Administrators will try to answer it with forms, missionaries with sermons, traders with contracts, soldiers with inspections. The answers will vary, and the variance will produce the next decades of work and trouble. You end by placing a finger on a map that is not a map, the mental one drawn by watching people move between their fields, their courts, their dances, and their griefs. The Zulu kingdom as a centralized power has been broken. The Zulu people have not. They will adapt, negotiate, resist, and join according to the season and the opportunity and the need. The mundane tasks will continue to build capacity that outsiders will misread as passivity. The question that keeps you from closing the book too neatly is this: after a system that answered a world so well has been forced to answer a different world, which of its strengths will become seeds for a new kind of competence, and which will become memories that comfort but do not instruct? You begin with a government drawing lines it thinks will settle matters. The country is carved into chiefdoms with names that please the ear of a commissioner and satisfy a report's need for tidy lists. On the ground, the lines cut through homesteads, grazing routes, and the unwritten agreements that made neighbors useful to one another. The appointed chiefs must prove themselves both to those who placed them and to those who did not ask for them. Authority becomes a balancing act performed on a rope strung between the office and the courtyard. To manage, a chief must be bilingual. In a political sense, he must speak the language of directives to the commissioners and the language of kinship to the elders. Some succeed by being quiet, some fail by being loud. The aftermath of division is a civil strain that sharpens into conflict. Men who fought for the old center now align with new poles of influence. Small quarrels become factional signals. A wrong word carries further than before. A campaign inside the country follows on the heels of the campaign from outside, because unsettled power always looks for outlets. The new administrators learn a lesson that many have learned. Partition is not peace, and the smallest unit that can be governed well is not necessarily the smallest unit that can be named. They find themselves back on the same paths, mediating the fallout from their earlier geometry with appeals to the same homestead wisdom they had underestimated, the Old ruler returns from exile for a season, his presence an attempt to reassemble dignity under constraints. He walks among his people, and the crowd's sound carries the complex chord of love, grief, and calculation. His return does not restore what was undone, it salves and unsettles at once. He dies, and the succession opens a new chapter in which a younger man must carry a title shaped by a reality different from the one that shaped the office. Advisors become as much gatekeepers as guides. Outside powers become umpires in matches whose rules they barely grasp. The country learns to live in layers, the formal one of proclamations and courts, the practical one of homestead arrangements, and epidemics demands, the spiritual one of ritual and the unbroken thread of language. In these years, a tax arrives with the quiet finality of numbers. It is required in coin, not in kind. Coin is not grown. Coin must be earned in places where coin circulates, towns, mines, farms, organized for export. Men go to earn it. They leave in bands, sometimes after initiation, sometimes before, sometimes as heads of households with promises to return in a season. The routes to work become new roads as real as any, remembered in songs that try to hold a feeling that is part pride and part hunger. In their absence, homesteads reorganize. Women expand the tasks they already held, taking on more of the cattle. Work, the field work, the negotiation with headmen and with minor officials who come to count and to suspect. Grandmothers become judges in matters that boys usually settled. Older brothers take the role of fathers. Cousins extend their definitions. This labor migration is often described with statistics. You hear it in kitchens. A woman counts months, without correcting herself when she repeats a number, because repetition is a way of making a future feel less uncertain. She plans seed and harvest with less muscle and more ingenuity, planting in the early hours, saving one good hoe blade, arranging for neighbors' sons to help with a task that requires more hands than she has, paying them in beer, meat, and the promise of reciprocity. She keeps a ledger in her head of obligations owed and owed to her, updating it with the care of a clerk. She listens to rumor about a new pass requirement or a shift in recruitment that would send men further away. She frames her fear as preparation and does not say the word fear. Language becomes a lifeline and a shelter. Oral literature tightens around memories of competence. Praise poetry. In the homestead grows slightly longer in the part that tells of a man's journey to work, and the gifts he brought back, a blanket that kept his mother warm, a small mirror, a piece of cloth whose color told a story, coins that were placed in a calabash with hope. Dances continue not only as performance but as rehearsal for the rites that help families stay recognized in the eyes of their elders, even as new authorities arrive with papers, seals, and stamps. The old authority moves in spoken lines that tie today's chores to yesterday's explanations. A people accustomed to managing change by narrative continues to do so, adding chapters without tearing out earlier ones. The cattle remain the second heart of the homestead. They are counted by eye. Their condition is a signal used by women who have become even more expert at reading what pasture can support and when medicine must be sought. Diseases arrive in waves, some from beyond the region, and the responses are as old and as new as necessary. Isolation of sick animals, cutting of losses, ritual acknowledgement that something beyond a single household's control has intervened, and quiet experimentation with remedies learned from neighbors or from strangers who pass through with stories of what worked by another river. Success and failure are both recorded in memory with little drama but with crisp clarity. Schools appear sometimes as tents, sometimes as rooms attached to missions, sometimes as a single shade tree under which a person who can read chooses to share what they know. Children learn to hold two scripts, one of the home and one of the office. The scripts do not immediately compete. They each cover tasks not covered by the other. A boy learns the tally sticks of cattle and the tall letters that form words like tax and receipt. A girl learns to count the jars of grain and to read a letter that tells her when a brother might return. The coin and the book conspire to change the timing of lives. The change is survivable because the homestead acts as regulator, slowing change as it enters so that it does not shatter the shelves. On Sundays and at festivals, new prayers are spoken, and old ones not discarded. People kneel and speak in a cadence taught by new teachers. They rise and pour beer in the yard in a cadence taught by elders. They do not call this contradiction. They call it life in a widened circle. The uninteresting truth is that people are adept at this, adding without unmaking, attaching without renouncing. The capacity to braid is a survival tool. It will be misread by administrators as confusion and by zealots as compromise. In kitchens, it is simply how to keep a family in tune with all the clocks it must now obey. Disputes continue to be managed with a combination of laws in ink and laws in memory. A young man returns from work with a temper sharpened by the hard attention of bosses and by the humiliations that coin requires. He speaks too sharply in the courtyard. The elders take him aside, and the conversation, though calmer than his pace, is firm enough to cut his pride down to size. A girl learns her worth not only by the cattle her marriage might bring, but by the respect shown to her competence. Around them, minor officials make rounds to collect levies. Their behavior varies with the quality of their instruction and the limits of their imagination. The better ones learn to sit a long time. The worse move too quickly and fracture what had been stable. People remember who came with empty mouth and who came with small kindnesses. A drought arrives and brings the old arithmetic into a new economy. Grain fails in places, cattle weaken in others. Men far away hear through letters that do not carry the weight of smell and sound. They send what they can, or they return, or they do not because the pass system is tight this season. The homestead adjusts as it has always adjusted, planting late where a second chance exists, moving cattle to ridges where the grass stays green a week longer, trimming ceremonies without unmaking them, boiling porridge a little thinner. These adjustments do not make news. They are a kind of quiet that keeps a people alive. You end the section with the ledger that matters. Has the day been made coherent despite the new demands on it? Has the tax in coin been met without eating the seed of next season's harvest? Have the young remained tethered to their elders by respect rather than by fear? Have the cattle returned to the kraal at dusk and the jars of grain held until the first rains? If the answers are yes enough of the time, survival becomes more than survival. It becomes the stage on which a next kind of claim can be made. The question that hangs as sleep comes is this: how long can a people keep paying the new tax, in coin, in absence, in patience, before they decide that the rhythm of their days must be renegotiated with those who collect it? You move into a century that speeds up without always warning its passengers. A railway line grows like a metal creeper across the landscape, its sleepers hammered down, its tracks gleaming in the sun. Trains appear with a sound that is not a voice of any local hill, and they carry things that used to be measured by days. An oxen, sacks of meal, barrels of salt, bolts of cloth, timbers, nails and coin. Work at the mines intensifies. The habit of leaving becomes a season in itself. Men carry blankets and a small pot, a stick, a little food. They join lines that have their own songs. Contracts are signed for periods that eat whole months. The work is measured by someone else's clock, and the punishment for slowness is someone else's voice. You watch men learn a new art, abating anger until the coin is earned, bending pride without snapping it, and then returning home with their own voice intact. In the cities, work is divided into tasks that sometimes feel smaller than a homestead task and sometimes larger. Underground, men blast rock, where a candle's flame could kill if it finds the wrong air. They learn to listen for the quiet that means a ceiling is unsafe. They learn to watch for the dust that means lungs are being sandpapered by an invisible hand. Above ground, the rhythm of shift changes sets a human tide to the city's clock. Men train their bodies to wake when darkness says sleep, to sleep when heat suggests waking. They meet other languages and other angers, and they form new homelands of talk that help them survive. In this they become cosmopolitan without thinking of the word, a cosmopolitan nature that is pragmatic and that returns to the homestead without apology. Money travels back along the rails and roads in small amounts that mean much. It buys a cow when bought at the right moment. It pays a tax when paid at the right counter. It allows a fence to be repaired with a wire that will last longer than a thorn branch. With money come accounts. Some are on paper, most are in heads. A woman becomes a treasurer of sorts, tracking the inflow from a husband or son and the outflow to necessities and obligations. She decides when to press and when to forgive, when to set aside coins in a pot whose location only she knows, and when to show the pot to quiet talk that has turned to suspicion. Her authority is not theoretical. It is the authority of the one who can make or unmake a month. Past laws tighten and loosen as administrators experiment with control. Permits are required, renewed, refused. Men learn the offices where a document can be stamped, and they stand in lines that test dignity. The humiliation does not remain in the city, it travels home in a man's shoulders. The elders know this and counter it not with lectures but with rituals that refuse to let the city be the only interpreter of a man's worth. They praise the work done at home on a weekend when men return. They schedule rites to give returning men a place where their voices are restored, not to superiority, but to belonging. If you want to understand why culture is not a luxury, stand at one such return and listen to the ordinary joy of a name pronounced properly after months of being mispronounced. Land becomes an argument. Laws define who may own and who may not, who may plant where, who may graze when. The map shrinks for some and grows for others. The homestead uses its old tools to adjust to less land, intercropping more carefully, moving cattle more frequently within a smaller range, using knowledge of soil and contour to coax crops from ground that does not forgive error. People shift their homesteads under the pressure of legality and drought, and proximity to what now must be reached, the place where a job waits, the place where a school is open, the place where a clinic's medicine has been promised. With each shift, they carry the grammar of their living and plant it again. Schools thicken. Children learn to write in exercise books whose lined pages teach order with each stroke of a pen. They carry news home, some of it useful, some of it corrosive. A boy corrects an elder's pronunciation of a borrowed word and is corrected in manners. A girl uses arithmetic to calculate in moments what grain should be set aside and what can be eaten. Books arrive that tell stories from elsewhere. Songs are learned that carry harmonies different from the ones sung in courtyards. A new cultural layer grows and begins to complicate identity. Complication is not failure. It is the material of adulthood. Health is both better and worse. Clinics treat ailments that homesteads once accepted. They also ignore people whose wounds are not visible to the eye trained in a particular curriculum. Women continue to hold the secrets of herbs and timing. They know when steam helps and when it harms. They know what can be mended by rest and what is, in fact, the body's way of telling its story must end. In epidemics, old and new systems are tried. Buckets of water are set at doorways. Soap becomes as valued as salt. A funeral is cut short. To protect the living, the dead are honored twice as carefully when conditions permit. Practicality and reverence are not enemies, they share a yard. Religion, like work, asks for a multiplicity of skill. People attend services in buildings with tin roofs and in courtyards with no roof. They sing in harmonies that ring in both spaces. They are told parables from ancient lands, and they tell parables from their own. A pastor visits a homestead where a ritual has just been performed, and the conversation is not an argument but a negotiation of emphasis. The best leaders in this space are translators. They translate grace into the grammar of cattle and grain, and they translate the stubbornness of habit into words that a new generation can love. Politics becomes an arena that is not the court. Under a tree but a hall in a town, a newsletter, a whisper, a poster on a wall, a union meeting. Men who learn to listen to one another in silence underground bring that skill into rooms where agenda items are written in chalk. They learn to withstand speeches and to ask for minutes that are not missing. Women who have run households with more complexity than a small factory demand recognition in organizations that are, too often, comfortable with thanking them and uncomfortable with elevating them. Progress is measured in committees that keep meeting even when hope is thin, in petitions drafted and delivered, in arrests borne, in releases celebrated without the illusion that a release is a victory. Conflict within the region does not vanish. It changes form. Disputes arise around land, leadership, language, and the distribution of resources brought in from outside. The homestead continues to absorb shocks by refusing to let them become narratives that define a life. A man is wronged. He is counseled to endure until enduring would make him small. He is then counseled to act in a way that keeps his circle, his actual circle of huts and his figurative circle of kin, intact. The narrow path between submission and rebellion is walked by many feet, and the path survives because the walkers talk to one another. You end in the middle of the century, not because the story is complete, but because stopping anywhere teaches the discipline of absorbing pattern rather than chasing spectacle. The pattern is resilient, work sent out and money returned, schools that teach and homesteads that train, chiefs who echo the office and elders who echo the yard, rails that glint and paths that hold, prayers spoken in rooms and under stars. You ask the question required by any period that has learned to live under someone else's timetable. How is strength measured now? In the coin in a pot, the child who reads, the herd that has survived on less grass, the songs that hold both, a new harmony and the old cadence. And which of these measures will be believed by those who still think they can know a people by a map? You step into the late 20th century where words like development and homeland have the ability to oppress and to be repurposed. A region is named a place for a people and yet administered without their true consent. The result is a political architecture that requires the homestead to do even more mending. A leader emerges who claims the language of culture and channels it into a party. Other leaders claim the language of revolution and channel it into unions and movements. The countryside becomes a diagram for others' ambitions. Its yards become recruiting ground and refuge. Its paths become routes for rumors and policemen. Violence arrives in waves that can be mapped and in gusts that cannot. Families learn again the old arts of checking the wind. They plan weddings with a margin for sudden closure. They store grain in two places, not one. They teach children to drop to the ground when the air fills with a certain kind of sound. They plant quick crops that will fill a gap if a season is shortened by a raid or a curfew. Nothing about this is glamorous. Everything about it is dignified. The homestead refuses to give away its rituals to fear. It tweaks them, trims them, moves them, but it does not give them away. Negotiations toward a new country take place in cities and hotels and on roads, blocked and then cleared. Their effect lands in the home as a change in the tone of speech. Men and women begin to find that the impossibilities of a decade are now mere difficulties. Passes are torn up, elections are held, a new provincial name is attached to an old land. Offices open where a person can ask for a service without shame. The speed of hope and the slowness of execution collide. The homestead, again, becomes the buffer. People continue to plant in the morning and to queue in the afternoon. They continue to count cattle at dusk and to count votes when called to do so. A constitutional monarchy remains not as the old engine of command but as a symbolic axle, a spoke around which pride and identity can rotate. The king performs rituals that stretch back into the homestead's memory. Dances, harvest ceremonies, praise sessions that remind those who listen that they are part of a narrative older than a railway and wider than a fence. Alongside this, the province is administered with documents that speak to budgets, roads, clinics, schools, and land. Tension between custom and law is managed by committees and by patients, by court judgments read aloud in rural halls and by elders who translate those judgments into jokes and proverbs that bite less as they move into daily life. Land is argued about with the same intensity as 100 years earlier and with new tools. Claims are filed, surveys done, maps drawn, and then challenged. A trust holds land on behalf of communities and becomes the focus of praise and anger. People discuss tenure with a fluency that would have surprised their grandparents. They talk about title as well as lineage, about the future of grazing and the future of houses that have corners the old huts did not. They improve huts with bricks where needed and keep huts that breathe where that makes more sense. They build houses that learn from both shapes, round rooms for coolness, square rooms for storage, and modern furniture. They build kitchens that hold an electric stove and a 3-stone fire. They do not apologize for these choices because they do not see them as betrayal, they see them as engineering. Work changes again. A service economy grows where mining shrinks. Tourism arrives to look at the landscape and to be told its stories, and people learn to tell stories without selling them. Craft work that was always for use is now also for sale. Beadwork that speaks 2 languages, carvings that carry the shape of ancestors and of new creatures invented to please. Pride in craft is not new, remuneration is. It brings both sovereignty and vulnerability, sovereignty in not asking permission to be excellent, vulnerability in needing markets that can withhold and flee. People learn to market without losing the humility that keeps family ties unbroken. Schools produce more children who speak 2 registers, 3 sometimes, home, school, and city. They carry phones that bring an elsewhere into a courtyard with the insistent chirp of a message. Gossip grows faster and is more dangerous when it is not anchored by the sight of the person speaking. Elders adjust. They learn the new technology's limits by asking what of it can be used to strengthen the old chores. A message sent to warn of a dipping tank schedule, a call made to keep a funeral from starting late, money sent electronically with a P note that carries the softness of a voice. The combination works when the phone is made to serve the courtyard rather than the other way around. Health is administered in clinics with files and in kitchens with tea. Both matter. Nurses monitor blood pressure and sugar with machines that hum. Grandmothers monitor stress with a glance at a child's sleep and a hand on a back that has grown tight from worry. HIV sweeps in and is fought with a combination of modern medicine and the old disciplines of restraint and accompaniment. Tuberculosis returns and is met with the practical response of isolating and then bringing food to the isolated. The homestead's ability to distribute care as an unremarkable task of the day saves lives that a busy clinic would otherwise lose for lack of a visit. Politics remains noisy. The homestead remains steady. Elections are held that are fair enough to keep hope alive and flawed enough to keep anger honest. People attend rallies and then attend to goats. They write to newspapers and then write to each other in notes left under a pot lid where lunch is kept warm. Protest stays in the toolkit, so does negotiation. The province becomes the kind of place where two truths sit together, that it is possible to get things done and that most big things will take longer than they should. Patience does not become passivity because patience is used as a fuel, not a brake. Culture is not a museum. Dances and ceremonies continue to train bodies and minds to coherence. The reed dance occurs with the dignity of a ceremony that teaches values and meanwhile enjoys the fact that it can be enjoyed. Harvest ceremonies bless the next season, and remember that blessing without seed is vanity. People dress in clothes that read like sentences to those who can read them. These beads say this, that pattern says that. They speak languages that are, themselves, drums for memory. Young people brandish both tradition and novelty like tools, not like masks. They do not have to choose because they are learning that the danger is not hybridity. The danger is boredom and cynicism. You close by standing again at a kraal at dusk. Cattle enter with the same gentle arrogance. Children shout in registers you know. A phone buzzes with a note about a meeting tomorrow. The house holds both a plastic basin and a clay pot. The kitchen holds both an old gourd and a metal kettle. On the horizon, a wind farm's blades turn, feeding a grid. In the yard, a grandmother tells a story in which a man avoided a fight and thereby won a friend who saved his crop in a dry year. The story is old and new. It is farming and politics. You end with the only question that carries the careful curiosity. This place deserves, in a century that will keep accelerating, how will this people continue their excellence at deciding, each morning, what to carry forward and what to set down, and how will they keep the clocks they must obey from rearranging?
The room where they eat